So one of my big pet peeves in the New Testament is the word hell, because hell has a massive amount of assumptions attached to it in English when we use that word. But there's actually 3 different Greek words that get translated that way in our Bibles today. Hades, Tartarus, and probably the big one, the one that Jesus uses anyway, that's Gehenna. But a lot of these big, scary, infamous words in the Bible, words like Hel and Armageddon, actually carry with them a lot of cultural assumptions and, maybe more importantly, cultural histories that are being played into and played off of when people use those terms. And if we're going to understand them today, if we're going to get what Jesus is trying to communicate when he uses these very loaded words, we have to take some time to understand the history behind them. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord. He set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. Now, before we go any farther here, let's ask a question. What kind of valley is this? And in keeping with Apocalypse, I'm going to say I don't think it's a real valley at all. It's a metaphor. However, I do think this valley is meant to invoke one of, or perhaps both of, 2 very real, very significant valleys in the Hebrew story. Those are the valleys of Hinnom and the valley of Megiddo. Now, those particular locations may not elicit much of a reaction for you. It's possible you've never even heard of them before, but it's likely you've heard of Hel and Armageddon. So let's talk about those. Because the valley of Hinnom, it's translated Gehenna in Greek, and that's the word that Jesus uses that gets translated hell in our New Testament. Now, in my opinion, that's a bad translation. It should absolutely just be left as Gehenna. Whether you think that Jesus is using Gehenna to speak metaphorically of hell or to refer to the specific location, that's fine. I just think we should leave Jesus at what he says rather than putting our interpretive spin on his words. But Hinnom was the site of some famous carnage. In the period predating the Babylonian exile, the Hebrew scriptures describe Hinnom as a place where child sacrifices were offered to the Ammonite god Molech. And then in 2 Kings, the righteous king Josiah, quote, desecrated the valley of Hinnom so that no one could ever use it again to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire of Molech. That's where we get this idea that you may have heard where Gehenna referred to a garbage dump outside of Jerusalem. Now, historically, is any of that true? It's tough to say. Were children ever actually sacrificed in this valley? Was it ever a dump where garbage was burned? Truth is, it gets really hard to find archaeological evidence to prove any of that. But in the scriptural narrative, in the collective memory of the Jewish people, that is absolutely what Hinnom represented for them. Something like a hell on earth. That's why Jesus uses it in the New Testament. All right, let's talk about Megiddo. Well, the term Armageddon comes from a phrase in the book of Revelation, Har Megiddo. And that means the mountain of Megiddo. And that's a pretty big giveaway to what the author is trying to do with this term because, well, there is no mountain of Megiddo. There was only a valley in Megiddo in the middle of the plains of Jezreel. And so in Revelation, John is like hammering you over the head with a neon sign that says, look, this is not a real place. I'm using a metaphor here. And for that metaphor, I want you to think about Megiddo. And just like Hinnom, Megiddo was pretty infamous. The Egyptians fought Kadesh at Megiddo. The Assyrians fought Babylonians at Megiddo. The righteous King Josiah that we just talked about was killed at Megiddo. Deborah fought the Canaanites at Megiddo. Gideon went to war with the Midianites at Megiddo. Saul fought the Philistines at Megiddo. It's another hell on earth. So when Ezekiel talks to being taken to a valley full of bones, you may have some imagination where the story is going. You may have heard about how these bones come together and come back to life, and all of that resurrection and return imagery may flood in, overpowering the starting point here. But what you have to understand is that this story starts in hell. And not just like Dante's imagination of hell with fire and hooves and pitchforks and red pajamas. No, this is something much worse than that. Because Ezekiel has just watched his nation fall. He's seen his capital crumble. He has been witness to his friends marched off into exile away from their families and their lands. And so he invokes these very infamous valleys, these places of desolation, not as a cute starting point for an uplifting story, but to very firmly ground you in the worst moment of your life. The Lord led me back and forth. I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. When the prophet Isaiah wants to bring up an image like this, take you here, he talks about the worm that never dies and the fire that's never quenched. That's not about everlasting fire. It's not about worms that magically keep munching without ever getting full. It's about this image here in Ezekiel. Like there's nothing left to burn. No one was able to put out the fire. There's nothing left to decompose. No one was able to stop the worm. There is nothing like hope left here at all. Just very dry, burned out bones. And whether we want to talk about it or not, whether we want to bring it up in a series that's called Joy, that is a place that all of us find ourselves eventually. All right, if you made it that far, thanks for clicking through and listening. I know that's sort of a heavy passage, but it was actually part of a sermon on joy. And if you're interested, you can find the link down below to watch the whole thing when we turn that corner and we get to the point where Ezekiel brings us back to the hope and the joy that we have in the way of God. By the way, if you're interested in the work that we're doing here at Commons, you can always click subscribe, you can give us a like and a comment, and you can join our Discord server where we're encouraging the community to have lots of conversations about following the way of Jesus here in the world today. Have a great week. We'll see you soon.